35 years ago, on the night of January 19, 1990, for the first time in the history of the USSR, by order of Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Soviet troops entered Baku and a number of Azerbaijani districts. This is how the Soviet leadership reacted to the protests of the Azerbaijani people against Armenia's aggression, which put forward territorial claims to our country. The military invasion of Azerbaijan was accompanied by cruelty and unprecedented atrocity. A 65,000-strong military contingent, most of which were soldiers and officers of Armenian origin, driven by ethnic hatred towards the Azerbaijani people, they entered Baku from 5 directions. Suddenly, and without warning, tanks and armored vehicles crushed cars and people, shelled houses and civilians. Before a state of emergency could be declared, the soldiers mercilessly killed 82 people. On January 20th and the following days, in Neftchala and Lankaran, 147 people were killed, 744 people were wounded, and over 800 people were arrested. Let us repeat. This was how the Soviet Union treated Azerbaijan and its peaceful inhabitants. Hundreds of innocent people were killed in the streets of their hometowns. Some were even killed in their own flats. None of them could have ever imagined that Soviet soldiers would shoot at their own citizens, but nevertheless they did. They fired bursting bullets. They killed people, shot buses and cars, including ambulances. About 200 houses and 80 cars were shelled. A huge amount of state and personal property was destroyed. And all this horror, all this atrocity, took place in a complete information blockade. Television and radio did not work. Newspapers were not published. On the eve of January 19, sabotage group Alpha deliberately blew up the Azerbaijan television power unit. However, thanks to intervention of our national leader, the information blockade was broken the next day. On January 21, 1990, Heydar Aliyev arrived at the Azerbaijani embassy in Moscow, where he held a press conference, where he then proceeded to call the authorities who allowed the terrorist act in Baku criminals. He called the massacre of civilians a historical crime against the entire nation. It's thanks to this that the world was able to learn about the tragedy of 20 January. At Heydar Aliyev's behest, on November 21st of the same year, the Supreme Majlis of the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic adopted a resolution, which for the first time gave a political and legal assessment of the January 20 tragedy. However, even after Azerbaijan regained its independence until 1993, none of those who were in power at that time had the courage to reveal the whole truth about the tragic event. It was only on the initiative of national leader Heydar Aliyev, who returned to power in our country by the will of the people, that the January tragedy was given political and legal assessment at the state level. By the decree of the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan on holding the 4th anniversary of the tragedy of January 20, dated January 5, 1994, Milli Majlis of the Republic of Azerbaijan was recommended to consider the issue of holding a special session related to the events of Bloody January. In the March 29, 1994 Milli Majlis bill, the perpetrators of the tragedy of January 20 were specified, and this bloody action was classified as a war of aggression, and the crimes committed by the totalitarian communist regime hellbent on choking the life out of the national liberation movement in Azerbaijan to break the faith and will of people. The memory of the martyrs was immortalized. The Eternal Flame Memorial Complex was erected in the Alley of Martyrs. January 20 was declared the day of national mourning. Today, 35 years after the January tragedy, the people of Azerbaijan honor the memory of all those who died in those terrible days. But now our hearts are filled not only with bitterness of loss, but also with triumph and great pride for our people. After all, it was this tragic night from 19 to 20 of January that marked the beginning of a long road to freedom and independence for Azerbaijan. Over the past 35 years, Azerbaijan has traveled an unprecedented path of development, gaining prestige in the region and the world. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of our country have been restored thanks to the great victory in Karabakh, as well as the successful anti-terrorist measures carried out in September 2023. All this became possible under the leadership of President of Azerbaijan, Supreme Commander-in-Chief Ilham Aliyev. It is thanks to the unrelenting and persistent determination of the President of our country, as well as his calculated and balanced domestic and foreign policy, which allowed for the mobilization of all forces, paving the way for victory. Therefore, today, on the 35th anniversary of the terrible tragedy of Black January, we can say with confidence in our hearts that the souls of all our martyrs have found peace, that their blood was not spilled in vain. It is thanks to their sacrifice that today, January 20, is not only the day of national mourning, but also the day for chronicling the tales of courage and heroism of the Azerbaijani people, who valiantly and against all odds fought for the sovereignty and independence of our country, and who eventually won.